everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on renewable energy and sustainability. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David Smith, Professor Robin Daly and Dr. Tamanna Khoshla. First, I would like to give chance Professor David Smith and my first questions to you. Uh, what are the primary source of renewable energy and how do they differ in terms of availability and utilization?
Sharif, great question. And as you begin to look at them, let me just set the stage 1 minute and then go and answer the question. Renewable energy and sustainability are really closely related concepts, but they do have some distinct different meanings as you look at it. Renewable energy is energy that comes from sources that naturally renew themselves at a rate allowing them to meet our energy needs. These include things like biomass that we've talked about, geothermal, hydropower, solar, and wind. Uh, and these sources replenish themselves over time. Solar power can always be replenished, unlike fossil fuels that take millions of years to form. Uh, and their sustainable energy, though, comes from energy sources that can fulfill our current needs without compromising future generations. So it is not naturally there. So uh, the long-term viability of some of the sustainable energy is not really there yet, but it provides good environmental stewardship. So I wanted just to kind of get that definition out as you put your topic out on this one. Um, and so to answer your question more, solar is really one of the dominant sources today as you look at it as a contributor to renewable energy generation. It's expected to provide about 45 to 50% of global electricity by 2030 and increasing that as we go towards 2050 to as much as 65 to 70%. Wind power is another significant player in the renewable mix, but it does have challenges with it. Particularly, I know in Texas with our uh, windmills here, they kill quite a bit of migratory birds and other things like that going through. So even though it's a source of power, it does have some other side effects. And it also is one that if there's no wind blowing, it doesn't generate power. So you have that. Uh, and you begin to see that these renewables can be a low cost form of energy uh, for both economic and environmental reasons there. But governments worldwide are really trying to set up, because of the United Nations, COPs, and others, a transition to triple renewable energy power by 2030 to help with the decarbonization. Now, there are net zero commitments, but they're lagging behind there, and you see that. And there's now in the Global Energy Perspective 2030, which is part of the Paris Agreement, there is increased emphasis in funding these renewable energy sources to make up the differences there, Sharif, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing nations as well. And that mix is going to change. I believe you're going to also see during the time period we're talking about, Sharif, added to that mix newer forms too. We're seeing now a beginning commercialization of small micro nuclear reactors that can begin to be deployed and used. We're seeing increased uses of hybrid approaches of renewable energy, sometimes supplemented by traditional energy sources in microgrids and mini grids. We're seeing kinetic energy beginning to be used more as part of those sources, which we've talked about in the past as part of this energy mix. So there's many sources there, but like I said at the beginning, you really begin to see that solar energy, wind energy, the top two. Then I think if you go after that, you're going to see the hydropower, then the geothermal, then the biomass, then the genetic and the nuclear option, all added to that mix. So, Sharif, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. My next questions to Mr. Rob: how does the integrations of renewable energy source contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and combating climate change?
Well, these alternative energy sources, be they geothermal, solar, wind, or wave, hydroelectric, are, I mean, they don't produce waste, at least not while they're generating. And there are some issues in terms of manufacturing pollution, say with storage batteries, that are somewhat problematic, but they don't contribute to climate change. They can contribute to other forms of pollution. However, particularly when it comes to disposal and mining for the battery source. As David pointed out, I think that there are alternatives to lithium-ion that are much more sustainable, but also require a substantial amount of manufacturing or construction proficiency in terms of the gravity methods for storage, whether they be a heavy lift or pushing water up and down. But they don't produce the same kind of pollutants. As David also pointed out, the downside is the most popular forms of sustainable energy tend to be less than 24 by 7. Now, wind tends to be early afternoon to early evening. Solar, of course, is when the sun's up, and I've got a major solar plant here on my home, and for much of the winter, it didn't really generate because we were overcast so much of the time, which is always a problem with solar. And so that typically means you have to supplement with some form of generation that is petrochemical based, and is polluting. So the goal is really to find a sustainable power source that works 24 by 7, doesn't kill birds. I should point out that later, more recent fan designs, windmill designs, use different technologies from resonance, where the mechanism moves back and forth, to rotational, but instead of rotational on a vertical plane, rotational on a horizontal plane, so that the birds aren't captured and killed. The difficulty is on a fast-moving fan, the birds don't see the blades and they run into them and it kills them. But we have other technology that can prevent that. There was a problem with the manufacture of windmill blades, particularly with regard to the disposal of them. Once they had reached end of life, but that's been worked as well. We're slowly working through some of the long tail environmental problems with some of the sustainable energy sources. But for the most part, we're making progress. But the underlying goal is to find an affordable 24 by 7 sustainable energy source, much like the sun, and some of the efforts to make the sun provide a 24 by 7 generating capacity by using solar generation has shown promise, with the problem being energy delivery to the terrestrial surface. That's also being worked, and so at the end, we're kind of in a transition phase with regard to these sustainable sources. We spent a long time thinking we had plenty of energy, we could waste it. And so we overproduced. We have a lot of problem with regard to energy loss via transport, which means we can't really use hydroelectric power as effectively as we'd like, since the hydroelectric sources, be they dams, tidal, wave sources, that they tend to be somewhat far removed from where we need the energy. Though it's interesting that historically, when we were building plants and using hydropower, we built the plants next to rivers, streams, rivers and streams, so they would get the power, and we could probably do much the same thing. Just rethink where we built factories and in this case data centers, which are our heavy energy users, and certainly we've seen things like when Facebook put their big data centers in this last cycle, they placed those data centers next to hydroelectric sources, so they had access to relatively strong sustainable energy. Of course, then we had the weather changes due to drought, which made those hydroelectric sources less viable than they had been. But the goal was right. It's just a matter of working through all the different elements and making sure the sustainable energy sources are in fact sustainable, are in fact reliable enough to provide the energy over the duration of time that you need. Our two big problems to really solve are energy storage, so you can use less than 24/7 generation effectively and efficiently, and you're not losing so much energy due to storage, and you're not dealing with the problems of lithium-ion waste and transport. We lose so much energy over transport that going to solutions like microgrids surrounding more sustainable methods of energy generation, like geothermal, which is 24/7, might be a long-term better solution. And David also brought up nuclear. We are once again exploring the concept of microplants, micronuclear energy plants, using relatively safe nuclear fuel. In fact, in some cases, using depleted nuclear fuel that has already been used on larger plants as part of the process of recycling that nuclear fuel, which was something that sadly we kind of got out of a while back, but we need to revitalize, because one of the big problems with the nuclear plants is is disposal of the fuel, and we do have the technology to do it. It's just a matter of deployment, and then using that nuclear fuel in other types of plants to make sure that it's fully depleted by the time it is disposed of, or recycled. So that's kind of the state of where we are right now.
Thank you. My next questions to Dr. Tamanna. What are some of the major challenges associated with the widespread adaptation of renewable energy technologies?
Uh, I guess, renewable energy is extremely important right now, and it has to be used. There's no way out, because of eco damages which have been caused by fossil fuels. And even now, for example, 80% of global population lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. That's about 6 billion people who are dependent on fossil fuels from other countries, which makes them vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. And we have seen tsunamis coming, we have seen storms coming, we have seen ozone depletion, and many of these problems. And so in contrast, renewable energy are available in all countries. It's just about a way how we harness it, and their potential is yet to be harnessed. The International Renewable Energy Agency estimates that 90% of the world electricity can and should come from renewable energy by 2050. Renewables offer a way of import dependency, allowing countries to diversify their economies and protect them from unpredictable price swings of fossil fuels, while driving inclusive economic growth, new jobs, and poverty alleviation. So, I mean, all of them can come together. So, I mean, then also renewable energy, in contrast to other kind of fossil fuel energy, is much cheaper because it's present with you, and they are not depletionable. So, renewable energy actually is the cheapest option in the most part of the world today. Price for renewable energy technology are dropping rapidly. The cost of electricity from solar power fell from 85% between 2010 and 2020. Cost onshore and offshore wind energy fell by 56% and 48% respectively. Falling prices, so I guess, it's also healthier. And according to WHO, about 99% of the people in the world breathe air that exceeds air quality and limits and threatens their health. And more than 13 million deaths around the world each year are due to avoidable environmental causes, including air pollution. So, the unhealthy level of fine particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide originate mainly from burning of fossil fuels. In 2018, air pollution from fossil fuel caused $2.9 trillion in health and economic cost, about 8 million billion a day. Now, renewable energies to create jobs, for example, for people, and which is much required in the developing world, and it also makes economic sense. So, about $7 trillion was spent on subsidizing the fossil fuel industry in 2022, including through explicit subs- subsidies, tax breaks, and health and environmental damages that were not priced into the cost of fossil fuels. In comparison, about 4 trillion a year needs to be invested in renewable energy until 2030, including investments in technology and infrastructure to allow us to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So the upfront cost can be daunting for many countries with limited resources, and many will need financial and technical support to make the transition. But investment in renewable energy will pay off in the far run. The reduction of pollution and climate impacts alone could save the world around $4.2 trillion by 2030. So, I mean, many of these things are there. But the fact is that, these energies are still being developed. I mean, the technology to develop them is still being developed. And, I mean, the poor countries are finding it difficult to cope up. I mean, there is a lot of, what do you say, I mean, the governments are playing smart in this, as far as the Western countries are concerned, and they are unwilling to transfer technology to many of these countries like Africa, etc. Africa, and that is why the global South is now helping with them come to terms with many of these technologies. For example, that's why Africa right now is in much support of Russia. In the war between Ukraine and Russia, and so global South, for example, has a different perspective rather than the North, for example, their perspective. So they have all come together, in voice. So you can, I mean, Russia could transfer, for example, technology to cheap technology. That's the word we need to understand, that it should be cheap technology, because we can't afford too much of money to be spent on this, otherwise we'll run short of technology. So I guess that is the whole thing. Until the time that doesn't happen, I guess global South amongst themselves should help each other develop technologies which are clean and sustainable, in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, how can advancement in energy storage technology help overcome intermittency issues associated with renewable energy?
Uh, we're seeing new technologies introduced all the time as we look at this. The biggest ones, I think, are some of the ones that I talked about and Rob talked about earlier, is that we're seeing the use of new approaches to atomic power, nuclear power, because that is one that I think you will see um, one of the cleanest sources of energy there. Um, but you're saying, as Rob talked about, and as I referred to, particularly when we look into things like uh, w- kinetic energy, and there's a particular area of kinetic energy called hydrokinetic, which is energy captured through the kinetic energy sources of moving water like waves, ocean currents, rivers. And this is a way where you don't need dams or reservoirs like you do with traditional hydroelectric. This is one that I think we're going to see more usage as well too, because it's an innovative way and much less intrusive than having to take away land and uh, dam rivers and create that. So you're going to see that is another one. While I'm still on water, you're beginning to see a technology called ocean energy begin to come in place. This was developed a lot by the different militaries around the world, but it's trying to look at how to use ocean thermal energy conversion to generate power. And this ocean energy is still in the very early stages, but because of the vast amounts of water on the planet, it is one that I think you're going to see more. Uh, Biomass, biofuel, all of these are ones that there's considerable research and beginning to be increased deployment of. You know, biomasses and biofuels are derived from organic matter, and we've talked in the past about how these can be used for multiple purposes in addition to generating energy. You know, they can generate fertilizer, they can generate a lot of other things and create it. But there's really some very interesting innovations made, particularly when you look at algae as a biomass, as you look at the residue from harvesting crops and some of the other non-food stocks that are beginning to go in there. Um, you know, we've talked about wind power, and uh, uh, Rob is correct that we're seeing new blade structures, we're seeing new areas there. We're also seeing uh, just like in warfare, which was mentioned earlier, we're actually seeing countermeasures beginning to be put around some of these large wind farms to actually scare the birds away and other things like that. Uh, and we're seeing more and more wind power going offshore. Uh, and we're seeing new ways to transmit that energy back, both from traditional means and also wireless transmission of energy is picking up to in order more of that. Um, the other thing that we're seeing is, in a couple of other quick areas, in hydropower. Uh, in the past, you wanted to create large reservoirs and have dams there with multiple large generators there uh, to generate power, and that is a, a, a moderately cost approach. But one of the innovations we're seeing now in hydropower is small scale hydropower systems that are beginning to be able to go into remote areas and not have to create these big reservoirs and these big dams, but smaller ones to uh, generate energy in these small scale hydropower systems. Again, particularly serving remote areas. I think, Sharif, this particular small scale hydropower systems will have tremendous impact in the developing world. And the other area that we're seeing a lot of science and a lot of innovation right now is in geothermal. I can tell you around where I live here in Texas, there's dozens of companies popping up and large research institutes in a couple of our larger research universities in Texas, where we're looking at how to use increasingly geothermal power, which really taps into the Earth's internal heat. And we've seen it, for example, using steam or hot water for that. We're seeing geothermal also beginning to be used as a mechanism to, for example, in Texas summers, actually we're looking at geothermal transfer processes to i- i- decrease the need for using energy for generating cooling. We're seeing it being used even in a place where we can use it to heat water for even residential use. So, Sharif, those are some of the ones that there's a lot of innovation happening at this time, and there are ones which I think there's impact. And as you heard me say, multiple of these new innovations are well suited for smaller scale energy, renewable energy generation versus the classic very large scale, for example, that we've done here in Europe and in China in the past.
Thank you. Professor Rob, my next questions to you. What role do government policy and regulations play in promoting transactions towards renewable energy and sustainability?
Well, that's the role of government to a large extent, particularly when you've got a technology that on its face isn't as inexpensive as petrochemical can be. You would think renewable energy would be cheaper since it's renewable. But part of the issue we're dealing with is a lot of governments, including the one here in the United States, subsidizes the petrochemical industry, which creates incentives to go the other way. And so government needs to switch its incentives from petrochemical production and distribution to sustainable energy. In fact, one of the professors I was following a while back went public with the idea that we really kind of need an effort similar to the effort the U.S. had creating the nuclear bomb, but focused on sustainable energy in order to solve some of the critical problems that remain unsolved for sustainable energy. And mostly his comments were mostly focused on storage, which is where we have a severe technological shortfall at the moment. Because if our storage was less polluting, longer lasting, and more efficient, the viability of sustainable energy would be far higher to be able to compete much better with petrochemical on merit. And so having governments subsidizing petrochemical use, production and transport is counterproductive at the moment when you want to move the world to a more sustainable ecosystem. And so having governments switch that promotional activity, that investment from petrochemical to sustainable energy would make a huge difference across the board. And so to a large extent, government, while on one hand is saying sustainable energy is important and they want to support it, on the other hand is still financing and fiscally supporting the alternative trend, which is creating problems. And currently, the petrochemical industry, through marketing, is pushing back pretty hard on the sustainable energy concepts. By the way, I should point out at the same time, the petrochemical industry is trying to pivot with some of the major petrochemical companies talking about removing gas stations or replacing them with charging stations for electric cars, and talking about much more efficient fuels and plastics that either don't pollute or aren't as polluting as other mixes. But it's kind of a day late and a dollar short for the technology, unfortunately. Petrochemical industry should have pivoted long ago. One of the alternatives, of course, is that uses the petrochemical ecosystem is hydrogen. It is a much more sustainable energy source than petrochemical, and it could use fueling stations that could replace gas stations. You do have to replace the tanks, the pipes, and much of the ecosystem, but you create hydrogen through electrical conversion, and that means you can kind of do it almost any place. In fact, you could use a sustainable energy source to create hydrogen, and then you could use the fuel source as you do with automobiles and kind of solve almost immediately the current lithium-ion battery problem with electric cars. But I think in the end, the governments need to have a clear idea of what they want to accomplish and then focus their resources on accomplishing it. Mostly governments are cross purposes, as I mentioned, both financing petrochemical and sustainable energy sources at the same time, and often the petrochemical sources get the larger budget item because they're more contributory to the political campaigns of the politicians making the decisions. So we do need to systematically go through and put the governments on the side of the planet and make sure that incentives are making a positive difference and not a negative difference as we go forward, and certainly remove the conflicts. You really can't support both sides of this. If you want a more sustainable world and a healthier world, then these incentives need to focus on that outcome, and not supplementing or assisting the prior technology. But I do believe that if you are going to provide incentives to the petrochemical industry, they should be focused on helping the industry convert. Putting the petrochemical industry out of business won't work. It's simply too powerful. So helping that industry convert to a more sustainable structure would make the most sense here. So allow the incentives to go through, but make sure that they're earmarked so that the petrochemical industry can convert to a more sustainable energy source and business model, and thus stops fighting the conversion and becomes an advocate for it, and then things will happen pretty quickly. But right now it's a mess, and to a large extent it's a mess because governments are not focused, and they're at cross purposes.
Thank you. Dr. Tamanna, my next questions to you. How do renewable energy system impact local economy and job creations?
Okay. For example, as far as India is concerned, with the Union Budget 2023 and 2024, the Government of India reiterated its commitment and focus on sustainability, allocating rupees 35,000 crore of priority for capital investment. So, investment is something which the government is promoting in a big way in India. This is a big boost for the nation's energy transition and will contribute to the country's energy security. The commitment of the government on key initiatives such as national infrastructure pipeline and national hydrogen policy. Also, we are importing technology from Australia and many of these countries. It will continue to foster growth of power sector and decarbonization. That's what mostly is required. And globally, energy transition is seen as the most significant investment since industrialization began. It requires balancing energy sustainability, affordability, and reliability. So, I mean, as far as jobs is concerned, the government has created many of these new ministries, and I mean, as far as the poorest sections of the country are concerned, and the agrarian sector, the burning of the shaft, for example, all these uh, rudimentary energies which have been used since past have to be done away with, and new technologies have to come up so people in the agrarian sector can get jobs in these industries, for example, which are opening up structures and industries which are more people friendly. So I guess jobs are going to open up more rather than through fossil fuels. And for example, the wind technology, the solar energy, all of them require manpower. Obviously, creating all these instruments, etc., would also require manpower, man or women power. And wind energy, for example, both the professors were also talking about wind energy harnesses the kinetic energy of the moving air. So, this this has been used in India since past, but people have to be involved. More research has to be done into it. Scientists and many of the people in the social sciences background have to come together and have for example, research on geothermal energy and how what resources from India can we use. So geologists would be required, and obviously, as I've told you, poor people and the middle class people, men and women as well, their brains together have to be used so that we follow the SDGs of the UN. India too has SDGs in every state, for example, and every state is trying to promote sustainable development goals of the UN, and so we have report every year on SDGs. And so hydropower, for example, is another. Ocean energy, India has till the 12 nocturnal miles, it's our uh, property, for example, India's property. So the ocean energy also is derived from technologies that use kinetic and thermal energy of sea water, waves or currents from the instance. So many of our, states which are along the side of the sea, there we can have employment for many of the people like fishermen, or people who have knowledge of the seabed and the rock, this thing. And bioenergy, for example, bioenergy is produced from a variety of organic materials called biomass, such as wood, charcoal, dung, and other manures for heat and power production, and agricultural crops for liquid biofuels. So, modern biomass systems include dedicated crops of trees, residues from agriculture and forestry, and various organic waste streams. So, I mean, these things that can be used in several industries, for example, I mean, it's not just electricity, but also other areas like pharmaceuticals. Many of these can be used. So, research on this is particularly required in India, and we can share energy details from to other countries, especially in the global south, which are developing right now, and which are looking, which have been pressurized by the north to develop technology which is more people centric, and it doesn't destroy the ecosystem of the world. So I mean, obviously, when they are doing this, they have to transfer some amount of funds. The funds have to be created for developing world. There are countries which are rising and they can do it on themselves, but there are countries which cannot do it, and they are relying on traditional power structures. So I mean, so that has to be done, and all of them together will help create a better sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you. My next questions to Professor David Smith. What are some innovative approach to enhance the efficiency and affordability of renewable energy?
Sri, we talked a little about those last time I spoke, but some of the big ones are, for example, if we look at solar energy, which, as we said before, is the largest uh, percentage of renewable energy globally. We're seeing new materials brought into bear on both uh, the the material which coats the solar panels to increase the strength, but also the transparency for collecting it. We're seeing new ways within the solar panels themselves, which are increasing again the efficiency of the conversion process by focusing the thermal energy more efficiently. We're seeing new approaches in actually the collectors within them, and also in the computer systems that are controlling those. Uh, and same still on solar. Uh, Most solar panels are fixed panels. We're seeing more research and development that being done in making those solar panels where they can follow the sun more and adjust to that, which should again increase the efficiency there. Uh, as I talked earlier, biomass is an area with a lot of innovation going on as we look at the conversion process. I particularly have been following a couple of the projects in some of the really impoverished nations of the world where it's being used to not only generate energy, but also reclaim farmland and stuff that had been depleted before as a byproduct of the biomass that's being used to produce the energy. Uh, Both soil conditioning, fertilizer, uh, and other sources like that. The area I spoke about earlier where it's the small hydroelectric, a lot of new innovation there. The same thing with the uh, other types of hydrokinetics being used to produce power. So just a tremendous amount of innovation, Sharif. The other thing that's being done is this whole area of renewable energy is being impacted tremendously by the growth using Internet of Things type sensors. And we're seeing more and more sensors being deployed around it, which helps optimize and improve the efficiency of some of these renewable energy sources. And a final thing here, Dr. Sharif, is that we're seeing the impacts of some of the investment funds that have come out of the last two COP meetings being used to help uh, fund not just the traditionally large renewable energy projects, but smaller ones. And because you're seeing funding for these smaller ones, we're now seeing innovation being applied to look at how can I go from the very large projects down to smaller projects that can impact developing nations more, that can hasten the formation of these mini and microgrids, which I believe is a very innovative approach there. Uh, One of the other innovative approach that I didn't talk about earlier, but falls under the kinetic energy um, banner, is I have recently actually visited with two separate companies that are looking at different ways to generate power, and particularly with the improvements in batteries, like what Rob's talked about in his opening remarks, of taking wasted kinetic energy and converting it into power into the battery packs that then can be transferred to others. One of these companies is harnessing the kinetic energy of trains as they go across the country, and the other one is harnessing wasted energy from large freight haulers, 18 wheelers and things, to take with small add-ons to the wheels and the axles on those. They're generating energy going into battery packs, and then those battery packs are swapped out as they're going across the country and put into the power grid. So those are some of the more innovative ones I've seen, Dr. Shreve.
Thank you. Professor Rob, how do advancement in renewable energy research and development contribute to the overall goal of achieving a more sustainable and environment-friendly energy sector?
Well, they're at the foundation of it. I mean, that's really where we need to be putting our research and development dollars right now, is to creating more sustainable energy production and certainly better methods for the petrochemical industry that's in place, better methods to clean up the emissions from that industry as well. But yeah, research and development has been focused pretty at increasing levels at energy storage, energy transport, with some of the more recent breakthroughs on wireless energy transport looking fairly promising, though we still have excessive loss. And some of the more interesting things like CO2 harvesting, where they harvest CO2 out of the atmosphere and they turn it back into ethanol, reintroducing it as a fuel, but creating a more of a circular cycle where, yes, you're putting pollutants in the air, but you're also pulling them out again to turning them back into fuel. And at some point, you can see if that technology advanced enough, you could achieve balance where the environment is held at a steady state, and not getting any additional pollution, just recycling the pollution that's already been introduced. So kind of hope we can do a better job with plastics than we have. But even with regard to plastics and that kind of pollution, we're coming up with bioplastics and even petrochemical based plastics that degrade more elegantly and remove themselves from the environment in weeks and months, as opposed to decades and centuries, which is the problem we've got now. So there's a substantial amount of R&D focused on this effort. As I mentioned earlier, I think I tend to agree with the scientist I was reading about earlier that argued that it should be an effort similar to the effort we had in creating the nuclear bomb. If we really want to address this problem before the problem becomes so pronounced, the planet becomes unlivable. But yes, our research and development is at the heart of being able to solve a lot of these problems.
Thank you. Dr. Tamana, what's your closing remarks for today's session?
Yeah, I feel the energy sector is generally a male dominated structure, and women earn lower wages than men. In line with, I mean, there was a research paper which I was reading. I mean, it read that we find significantly fewer women working in the energy sector compared to men. In relative terms, the gap is more than twice as large as it is in the non-energy sector. In addition, wages for female employees are almost 20% lower than from the male employees, with the gap being somewhat greater than in the non-energy firms. Significantly, the wage gap between approximately the same when other factors are accounted for, indicating that the gap is not a function of gender difference in the skill level within the firm. So it's not the skill which is problematic. It's something problematic in the brain of people who are recruiting, individuals. I mean, that is what we have to understand, that uh, uh, we have to take care of people accordingly. And for example, transgenders and people with disabilities have to be included in the structure, so that a more ethical and equitable world is created, so that before creating a world which is free of pollution or of greenhouse gases, carbon footing, etc., we also have a world at the physical level which is equitarian, and a world which is ready to take this jump in a way which would provide a better world in sustainable development goals, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor David Smith, my last questions: how can communities and individuals actively participate promoting this renewable energy, and what's your closing remarks?
Well, that's a really good question. Again, as many of the topics we talk about, education is an important part of this. And so there needs to be a enhanced education process to where all parts of the ecosystem understand the places and roles. If I look, and particularly as I have traveled through developing nations, there seems to be very little understanding of renewable energy and sustainability. And so education will be a large part of that. Um, I also think as you look at the funding that came out, particularly the last two COP meetings, where dedicated funds have been put in place to implement solutions and enhance the science and technologies and the developing countryside, that's going to be a big impact. But my concluding remarks are actually uh, it's really, this is an area with a lot of new development, a lot of new innovation going on. Uh, One of the places where I think um, communities, governments, uh, universities, and entrepreneurs actually should focus more is the increasing trend away from large scale mega projects on this to more localized solutions, like the small nuclear reactors, the small uh, uh, hydro dams that can be built, the smaller type of kinetic energy sources using local small rivers as opposed to large ones, using wave energy, using thermal connectivity. The geothermal is one that for places where that's available, that can be a game changer. And the new technology is really helping make that very possible. So, Sharif, I think it's let's look at this from both the large scale, but also the more community driven, the smaller scale projects. And I think that is really the next big future in renewable energy and sustainability. So thank you.
Thank you. Professor David, Professor Rob, my last questions to you. What is the closing remarks from your side? And if you want to add any point for this sustainability and innovation.
Well, to dovetail on what David said, education becomes one of the most important things that we can do. So the people understand the importance of sustainable energy, understand the choices that you make when you go down a particular path, and understand why the priorities are what they are, so you can sustain an effort to replace fossil fuels, either replace fossil fuels or make fossil fuels more sustainable, and execute it efficiently. The other thing we need to do is really look at the existing ecosystem and work at converting as much of it as possible to a sustainable energy ecosystem. So we aren't fighting ourselves as we make this transition. We don't have a ton of time, and the fact of the matter is this should be a higher priority than it is, and we need to get government out of its own way and focus on solving the problems that it seems to want to solve, but is unable to do so because of conflicts. And so at the end, education, focus, and removing conflicts would be the way to move us forward to a more sustainable future. That's it for me.
Thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible. I request our speakers also share our content, and thank you for joining today's sessions. Thank you, bye bye, and take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.